By the spring of 1943, Germany's position on the Eastern Front was fundamentally altered. The catastrophe at Stalingrad had not only destroyed an entire field army, it had shattered the illusion that Germany could dictate the tempo of the war in the East. For the first time since 1941, the Wehrmacht faced a Red Army that was confident, numerically superior, and increasingly competent at large-scale operations. Yet Berlin did not interpret this shift as irreversible. Instead, German leadership believed there was still time to regain initiative, if it chose the battlefield carefully. The battlefield they chose was not accidental. It was deliberate, studied, and, in theory, ideal. After the Soviet winter offensives of early 1943, the front line formed a massive bulge around the city of Kursk. This salient projected westward, deep into German-held territory. From a German operational perspective, it presented a tempting target. If attacked simultaneously from north and south, the salient could be pinched off, encircling large Soviet forces and restoring a shorter, more defensible front. More importantly, Kursk offered something Germany desperately needed: predictability. Unlike the fluid chaos of Stalingrad or the endless depth of Soviet territory, the Kursk salient was fixed, visible, and geographically constrained. German intelligence knew where Soviet forces were concentrated. Rail lines, supply routes, and command centers could be identified. This was not a battle Germany would stumble into. It was one it could prepare for in detail. Preparation mattered, because Germany no longer had the margin for improvisation. By mid-1943, German manpower was strained, fuel shortages were chronic, and the Luftwaffe was losing air superiority. Every major operation had to promise decisive results. Kursk, in German eyes, offered exactly that. It was intended to be a battle of annihilation, not attrition, where superior German armor and tactics would destroy Soviet forces faster than the Red Army could replace them. The political dimension was just as important as the military one. After Stalingrad, Germany's allies were wavering. Italy was unstable. Romania and Hungary were increasingly defensive. Hitler believed a major victory in the East would restore confidence across the Axis coalition and demonstrate that Germany remained capable of offensive warfare. Kursk was meant to be proof that Stalingrad had been an exception, not the beginning of the end. Timing, however, became a critical and fatal problem. The original plan envisioned a spring offensive before the Soviets could fully recover from winter losses. But delays mounted. New tanks were promised, Panthers and Tigers that were supposed to restore German qualitative superiority. Hitler insisted on waiting for them. Each delay gave the Red Army more time. Time to dig. Time to mine. Time to study German doctrine and anticipate exactly how the attack would unfold. This was the first and most important miscalculation. Germany assumed the Soviets would either retreat from the salient or defend it conventionally. They did neither. Soviet command understood that Kursk was an obvious target. Rather than abandon it, they turned it into a trap. Layer upon layer of defenses were constructed. Trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, artillery kill zones, and deeply echeloned reserves. By the time Germany was ready to attack, the Kursk salient was no longer an opportunity. It was a fortress. Yet German leadership pressed on. The logic was rigid. Germany had spent months concentrating forces, allocating fuel, stockpiling ammunition, and committing its best armored units. Canceling the operation would mean accepting a purely defensive posture, something Hitler categorically rejected. Germany was still thinking in terms of decisive battles, even as the war was shifting toward industrial and logistical exhaustion. Another factor drove the decision: fear of Soviet initiative. German intelligence correctly assessed that the Red Army was preparing its own offensives. Waiting too long risked allowing the Soviets to strike first. In Hitler's mind, attacking at Kursk was not just about winning, it was about preventing a worse defeat elsewhere. The offensive became framed as a necessity rather than a choice. Crucially, Germany believed it had learned from earlier mistakes. The plan emphasized coordination, concentrated armor, and overwhelming force at the point of attack. Unlike Stalingrad, this would not be a sprawling urban nightmare. Unlike 1941, logistics would be more controlled. This battle would be fought on German terms, with German strengths fully leveraged. What Germany failed to grasp was that the Red Army had also learned. Soviet commanders no longer reacted blindly to German blows. They absorbed them, measured them, and responded with calculated force. The Kursk salient was not defended in hope. It was defended with intent. Soviet planners accepted casualties in advance, knowing that attrition favored them, not Germany. By choosing Kursk, Germany committed itself to a type of battle it could no longer win. It selected a battlefield that required sustained offensive power, deep reserves, and the ability to absorb losses while maintaining momentum. These were precisely the attributes Germany had lost by 1943. The decision to attack Kursk was not irrational. It was logical, based on outdated assumptions. Germany chose Kursk because it believed planning could compensate for strategic decline. It believed that if a battle was designed carefully enough, it could still bend the war back in its favor. That belief would be tested brutally in the months that followed. The German plan for the attack on the Kursk salient was conceived as a textbook application of operational encirclement. Officially designated Unternehmen Zitadelle, Operation Citadel, it was built around a single decisive idea: strike the salient from two directions, collapse it inward, and annihilate the Soviet forces trapped inside. On paper it was clean, symmetrical, and familiar. In execution, it demanded levels of speed, coordination, and endurance Germany could no longer guarantee. The plan called for a pincer movement. From the north, the Ninth Army under Walter Model would attack southward from the Oral region. From the south, the 4th Panzer Army, supported by Army Detachment Kempf, would strike northward from the Belgorod area. The two forces were to meet east of Kursk, sealing the pocket and destroying multiple Soviet armies in a single operation. The front would then be shortened by hundreds of kilometers, freeing German forces for future operations. German planners allocated their best remaining formations to the operation. Elite panzer divisions were concentrated in unprecedented density. New armored vehicles, the Panther tank and the Ferdinand heavy tank destroyer, were introduced in large numbers, intended to overwhelm Soviet defenses through superior firepower and armor. The Tiger I, already feared by Soviet crews, was assigned critical breakthrough roles. In theory, German armor would smash through defensive belts, exploit gaps, and restore mobile warfare to the Eastern Front. Artillery preparation was carefully planned. Unlike earlier campaigns, where speed had often taken precedence over methodical fire, Citadel emphasized deliberate destruction of enemy anti-tank positions. Engineers were tasked with breaching minefields under fire, clearing lanes for armor to pass through. Infantry formations were closely integrated with armored units, intended to protect tanks from close-range threats while maintaining forward momentum. Air support was also central to the plan. The Luftwaffe concentrated available aircraft to support the attack corridors. Close air support was expected to suppress Soviet artillery, interdict reserves, and maintain air superiority over the battlefield. German planners believed that localized air dominance, even if temporary, would be sufficient to tip the balance during the critical opening days. Timetables were strict. Success depended on rapid penetration of the 1st and 2nd Soviet defensive belts. Delays were not merely inconvenient, they were fatal. Every hour lost increased the risk of Soviet reserves being committed, and German intelligence knew the Red Army had deep reserves positioned behind the salient. The plan assumed these reserves could be engaged and destroyed piecemeal as they moved forward. This assumption underestimated both Soviet preparedness and mobility. The northern pincer faced immediate challenges. Model, a cautious and defensive-minded commander, had serious reservations about the plan. His sector faced some of the densest Soviet defenses. Minefields were extensive, anti-tank guns deeply emplaced, and terrain limited maneuver. Model repeatedly warned that his forces might not achieve a rapid breakthrough. His concerns were noted and largely ignored. The overall plan required both pincers to advance. Hesitation on one side threatened the entire operation. In the south, confidence was higher. The terrain was more favorable to armored maneuver, and the attacking force was stronger. German commanders believed the southern pincer would advance faster and potentially compensate for slower progress in the north. This asymmetry was risky. It placed enormous pressure on one axis to succeed decisively, while the other merely needed to hold its own. In reality, both needed rapid success. One of the most consequential aspects of the plan was its reliance on unproven equipment. The Panther tank, though formidable on paper, was rushed into service. Crews had limited training. Mechanical reliability was poor. Breakdowns were frequent even before combat began. The Ferdinand tank destroyer, heavily armored and armed with a powerful gun, lacked a machine gun for close defense, making it vulnerable to infantry. Germany was betting its last major offensive on machines that had not yet proven themselves under battlefield conditions. Logistics planning revealed further fragility. Fuel stockpiles were sufficient for the opening phase, but sustained operations depended on quick success. Ammunition was plentiful initially, but resupply under fire through contested terrain was never guaranteed. Unlike earlier campaigns, Germany could not rely on captured Soviet stocks to sustain momentum. This was a one-shot operation with limited depth. Crucially, the plan assumed that Soviet command would react predictably by committing reserves directly into the path of the German advance. This assumption reflected outdated perceptions of Red Army behavior. Soviet doctrine had evolved. Reserves were positioned not just to block breakthroughs, but to counterattack once German momentum slowed. German planners were preparing to fight the Red Army of 1941. They were about to face the Red Army of 1943. The final flaw lay in strategic rigidity. Once committed, Citadel allowed little flexibility. Forces were concentrated forward. Reserves were minimal. If the attack stalled, there was no graceful way to disengage without heavy losses. German leadership accepted this risk because it believed the alternative, strategic passivity, was worse. In reality, the risk was asymmetric. Germany risked everything. The Soviets risked much less. By early July 1943, the plan was ready. Units were in position. Equipment was deployed. The battlefield had been chosen, studied, and prepared for. Germany had done everything it believed necessary to ensure success. What it had not done was adapt its expectations to a changed war. When the attack began, it would not fail because it was poorly planned. It would fail because planning alone could no longer compensate for material inferiority, enemy adaptation, and the unforgiving arithmetic of attrition. When the German attack finally began in early July 1943, it did not unfold as an immediate disaster. On the contrary, the opening phase delivered several results that appeared, at least briefly, to justify months of planning and delay. German forces advanced. Soviet units were pushed back. defensive lines were breached. For commanders committed to the logic of Operation Citadel, these early gains seemed to confirm that the plan was working, if only slowly. The assault opened with intense artillery preparation, followed by coordinated infantry and armored advances along the designated axes. In the southern sector, where terrain favored maneuver, German panzer formations achieved their most visible successes. Armored spearheads penetrated multiple defensive belts, forcing Soviet units to withdraw under pressure. Minefields were breached at heavy cost, but breaches were made. German engineers, operating under fire, cleared lanes wide enough for tanks to pass, and armored units exploited these openings aggressively. German combined arms coordination was, at the tactical level, still formidable. Tanks advanced in close cooperation with infantry, while artillery suppressed Soviet strongpoints. Anti-tank guns were identified and destroyed through concentrated fire. Where German armor could maneuver, it inflicted disproportionate losses. In several engagements, Soviet tank units suffered heavily when forced to counterattack prepared German positions head-on. Air support also played a role in the early days. The Luftwaffe, concentrating its limited strength over narrow sectors, achieved localized effectiveness. Ground attack aircraft struck Soviet artillery positions and troop concentrations, while fighters contested the airspace aggressively. Though German air superiority was neither complete nor sustained, it was sufficient in places to support ground advances and disrupt Soviet movement during the initial phase. Psychologically, the early fighting reinforced German confidence. Reports from the front spoke of progress measured in kilometers gained and defensive lines breached. Commanders noted the destruction of Soviet armor and the capture of fortified positions. Compared to the chaos of Stalingrad or the retreating battles of the winter, Citadel felt controlled. German units were advancing into prepared defenses and still moving forward. That alone felt like a restoration of initiative. One of the most important early achievements was the demonstration that German armor could still penetrate deeply defended positions. Despite extensive minefields and layered defenses, panzer units proved capable of forcing entry through sheer concentration of force. This reinforced the belief that once the deepest defensive belts were broken, open maneuver warfare might resume. German planners had always believed the decisive phase would come after the initial grind. Early progress suggested that phase was still attainable. Losses, though significant, were initially accepted as the price of success. German commanders expected casualties in a prepared assault. Tanks lost to mines or anti-tank fire were regrettable, but considered tolerable. Infantry casualties were heavy, especially among assault units, but morale remained intact. Units believed they were moving toward a decisive outcome, not a futile struggle. Importantly, Soviet reactions in the opening phase did not immediately contradict German assumptions. Red Army units fought stubbornly but withdrew when overwhelmed. Counterattacks were launched, but often broken up by German firepower. This reinforced the perception that Soviet reserves would be fed into the battle incrementally and destroyed as they appeared. From a German perspective, the battle seemed to be unfolding according to a familiar pattern. The northern pincer, though less successful, also achieved limited advances. German forces there faced denser defenses and more restrictive terrain, but they did manage to penetrate parts of the Soviet defensive system. Progress was slower and costlier than anticipated, yet it was still progress. The operation had not stalled outright, which was a critical psychological benchmark. Another element that appeared to favor Germany was command discipline. Unlike earlier operations where momentum sometimes outran coordination, Citadel advanced deliberately. Units paused to consolidate gains, clear flanks, and restore cohesion before pushing forward. This reduced the risk of sudden collapse or overextension, at least in the short term. However, the very factors that made the opening phase appear successful concealed deeper problems. Progress was measured, not rapid. Every kilometer gained required disproportionate effort. Minefields were thicker than anticipated. Soviet defensive belts were deeper and more resilient. German losses, particularly in armor, accumulated steadily rather than catastrophically, but accumulation itself was dangerous in a war of attrition Germany could not win. Crucially, the Red Army did not panic. Soviet command did not commit its main reserves prematurely. Instead, it absorbed the initial blows, traded space for time, and preserved its strongest forces for later phases. From the German viewpoint, this restraint was misinterpreted as weakness. In reality, it was discipline. The opening phase of Citadel therefore represented Germany's last moment of plausibility. The offensive demonstrated that German forces could still fight effectively at the tactical level. Planning had translated into action. Units advanced. Defenses were breached. Losses were inflicted. For a brief window, the outcome still appeared undecided. Yet, beneath the surface, the offensive was already consuming Germany, faster than it was consuming the Soviet Union. Every minefield cleared cost tanks that could not be replaced. Every infantry assault depleted formations that had no depth behind them. The tempo of advance, slow, grinding, costly, was not merely inconvenient. It was decisive. What went right in the opening phase was real, but insufficient. Germany proved it could still strike. What it failed to prove was that it could strike decisively, sustainably, and faster than the enemy could respond. That failure would become impossible to ignore as the battle moved toward its turning point. The turning point of the battle did not arrive with a single dramatic collapse. It emerged gradually, through accumulation of delays, losses, and Soviet restraint, finally giving way to deliberate counteraction. By mid-July 1943, the German offensive around Battle of Kursk reached the point where success was no longer a matter of courage or tactical skill, but of arithmetic. And the numbers no longer favored Germany. The most visible sign of the shift was tempo. German advances continued, but at a pace that steadily eroded the logic of Operation Citadel. Penetrations that were supposed to take hours took days. Defensive belts that planners believed could be ruptured quickly demanded repeated assaults. Each pause to clear mines, reorganize units, or repair damaged vehicles allowed Soviet command to reposition reserves and reinforce threatened sectors. Time, which Germany could not afford to lose, was being spent in large quantities. Losses in armor began to matter in a way they had not in earlier campaigns. German tank units were not being wiped out in single engagements. They were being worn down. Panthers suffered mechanical failures at alarming rates, often breaking down before reaching the front line. Tigers, while formidable, were too few to carry the offensive alone and too slow to compensate for stalled units elsewhere. Every disabled or destroyed tank reduced the striking power of formations that had no replacements waiting in reserve. The battlefield itself amplified these problems. Soviet defenses forced German units into narrow corridors. Movement became predictable. Artillery fire grew more accurate. Anti-tank ambushes became more frequent as Soviet infantry learned the patterns of German advance. German units still won local engagements, but the cost per kilometer rose relentlessly. The critical moment came when Soviet command judged that the German offensive had reached its culmination point. This assessment was not based on territory lost, but on observed indicators: reduced German operational tempo, thinning armor concentrations, and increasingly cautious advances. Once these signs appeared, the Red Army began committing its main reserves, not to block, but to strike. The most famous engagement of this phase occurred near Prokhorovka, where large armored formations clashed at close range. The fighting was chaotic, costly, and tactically confused. German armor inflicted heavy losses, but Soviet units achieved their strategic purpose. They halted the German advance. Even where Soviet losses exceeded German losses, the outcome favored the Red Army because it stopped momentum. Germany could not afford to trade tanks at this rate. The Soviet Union could. Simultaneously, the northern pincer stalled definitively. Model's forces, already struggling against dense defenses, failed to achieve a breakthrough. Attacks devolved into costly frontal engagements against prepared positions. Progress measured in hundreds of meters came at the price of hundreds of casualties. The northern arm of the encirclement never reached the depth required to threaten Soviet rear areas. The symmetrical pincer envisioned in the plan ceased to exist as an operational concept. Air power further shifted the balance. While the Luftwaffe continued to fight aggressively, it could not sustain dominance. Soviet air forces increased their presence, contesting airspace more effectively and striking German ground units with growing frequency. The skies over Kursk became increasingly dangerous for German movements, further restricting daylight operations and slowing logistics. At the command level, hesitation replaced confidence. German commanders faced a dilemma. Continuing the attack promised diminishing returns at rising cost. Halting risked exposing units to Soviet counteroffensives. The rigid structure of the plan left little room for partial success. Either the salient was encircled or the operation failed. By mid-July, encirclement was no longer achievable. The decisive psychological blow came not from the battlefield itself, but from events elsewhere. Allied landings in Sicily forced a reassessment of priorities. Germany now faced simultaneous crises on multiple fronts. Resources committed to Kursk could not be spared indefinitely. For the first time, Hitler confronted the reality that even a limited continuation of the offensive risked catastrophic overextension. The order to halt offensive operations did not come because German forces had been annihilated. It came because the strategic purpose of the battle had evaporated. Continuing would only deepen losses without restoring initiative. This was a fundamental shift. Earlier, German offensives had been halted by defeat. Citadel was halted by recognition of futility. Once the offensive stopped, the initiative passed irreversibly to the Red Army. Soviet forces immediately launched counteroffensives against German positions weakened by weeks of combat. These were not improvised reactions, but planned operations held in reserve. German units, exhausted and depleted, were forced onto the defensive without time to reorganize. The turning point at Kursk was therefore not a single engagement, but a decision point. It marked the moment when Germany lost the ability to dictate the course of the war in the East. From this point forward, German operations would be shaped by Soviet actions, not the other way around. Tactical excellence could still win battles. It could no longer win campaigns. Germany had planned Kursk meticulously. It chose the battlefield. It concentrated its best forces. It struck with intent. The turning point came when planning collided with reality, and reality proved stronger. The war had changed. Germany had not changed with it. Once the German offensive lost momentum, collapse did not arrive suddenly. It arrived through pressure, relentless, widening, and systematic. The transition from attacker to defender was not clean. German forces around the Kursk salient were still engaged, still fighting, still inflicting damage. But they were now doing so without initiative, without operational depth, and without the ability to control the sequence of events. In a modern industrial war, that condition was fatal. The first sign of collapse was exhaustion. German divisions had been committed continuously since the opening of the offensive. Infantry units were depleted from repeated assaults against layered defenses. Tank crews had operated under constant stress, often sleeping inside vehicles, repairing machines under fire, and fighting at close range for days at a time. Mechanical attrition compounded combat losses. A panzer division that still existed on paper might have only a fraction of its authorized vehicles operational at any given moment. Logistics, already strained during the offensive phase, now worked against Germany. Ammunition consumption had been heavy. Fuel stocks were low. Supply routes were vulnerable to increasing Soviet air and artillery attacks. Unlike earlier phases of the war, Germany could not pause, refit, and resume. Any pause simply gave the Red Army more time to prepare the next blow. Soviet pressure intensified deliberately. Rather than seeking a single decisive counterstroke, the Red Army applied force across multiple sectors. German units that attempted to stabilize one area found their flanks threatened elsewhere. This forced commanders into reactive movements, shifting depleted units to plug gaps rather than massing strength. Every movement cost fuel and cohesion. Every redeployment diluted combat power. Soviet artillery played a central role in this phase. German positions were subjected to sustained bombardment that limited maneuver and inflicted steady casualties. Unlike earlier in the war, Soviet fire was coordinated, concentrated, and responsive. German infantry, lacking adequate shelter after advancing beyond prepared positions, suffered heavily. Morale did not collapse, but endurance did. German armor, once the centerpiece of offensive doctrine, became increasingly ineffective under defensive pressure. Tanks were used to counterattack locally, often in small groups, rather than as massed formations. These actions could blunt Soviet advances temporarily, but at high cost. Without sufficient infantry support and air cover, tanks were vulnerable to anti-tank weapons, artillery, and close-range attacks. Each loss further reduced Germany's ability to respond to subsequent Soviet moves. The Red Army's use of reserves now revealed the depth of its preparation. Fresh formations entered the battle where German units were weakest. These were not exhausted troops thrown into crisis, but units held back specifically for this phase. Their arrival shifted the balance decisively. German commanders, who had hoped to disengage, found themselves instead fighting to avoid encirclement. Psychologically, the situation deteriorated. German troops were no longer advancing toward an objective. They were fighting to hold ground that no longer offered strategic value. The original purpose of the operation, encirclement and annihilation, had vanished. What remained was a series of defensive battles, whose only aim was to limit losses. This change in purpose mattered. It affected decision-making, risk tolerance, and cohesion. The collapse was also institutional. German command structures, already rigid, struggled to adapt to a rapidly changing situation. Orders issued under offensive assumptions became obsolete within hours. Communication difficulties increased as units withdrew or repositioned. Coordination between formations weakened. While German discipline remained strong, flexibility was limited. Crucially, Germany could not choose when or where to disengage. Soviet offensives followed closely, exploiting every sign of weakness. Withdrawals, when ordered, were conducted under pressure, often across ground recently fought over and stripped of infrastructure. Equipment abandoned during the offensive now blocked retreat routes. Vehicles without fuel or spare parts were destroyed by their crews. These losses were not battlefield defeats. They were the cost of being outpaced by events. The collapse under pressure was therefore cumulative rather than spectacular. There was no single day when German resistance broke. Instead, each day reduced Germany's capacity to resist the next. Divisions emerged from the battle exhausted, understrength, and lacking equipment. Commanders could still fight tactically, but they could no longer shape the operational environment. By the time German forces disengaged from the Kursk area, the balance of power had shifted permanently. The Red Army had not merely stopped the offensive. It had absorbed it, measured it, and then dismantled it. The pressure applied during the collapse phase ensured that Germany could not recover its strength afterward. There would be no rebuilding period, no restoration of reserves. This was the decisive difference between Kursk and earlier German setbacks. In 1941 and 1942, defeat or stalemate still left Germany with options. After Kursk, options narrowed dramatically. The collapse under pressure revealed a deeper truth. Germany's army was no longer capable of sustained offensive or elastic defensive operations against a peer opponent. From this point forward, German forces on the Eastern Front would fight bravely and sometimes effectively. They would win local engagements and inflict heavy casualties. But they would do so while retreating, reacting, and losing ground. The collapse at Kursk was not just a battlefield outcome. It was the end of Germany's ability to recover from defeat. The end of the fighting around Battle of Kursk did not bring immediate collapse. German forces withdrew in order, fought delaying actions, and continued to resist with discipline. To the casual observer, it could appear that Germany had survived yet another crisis. Strategically, however, the outcome was irreversible. Kursk did not merely stop a German offensive. It ended Germany's ability to choose when and where to fight on the Eastern Front. The most immediate consequence was the destruction of Germany's offensive reserve. Operation Citadel had consumed the last concentration of elite panzer formations available in 1943. These units were not annihilated outright, but they were bled white. Tanks destroyed or abandoned during the battle could not be replaced at the required rate. Crews lost could not be trained quickly enough to restore effectiveness. Divisions that withdrew did so with sharply reduced combat power, often at a fraction of their pre-battle strength. Manpower losses compounded the problem. German casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands across the broader summer fighting that followed Kursk. Unlike earlier years, replacements were increasingly drawn from younger and less trained cohorts. The qualitative edge that had once allowed German units to compensate for numerical inferiority eroded rapidly. Kursk marked the point where Germany's army began to lose not just numbers, but institutional experience at scale. Material losses were even more decisive. Tanks lost at Kursk were among Germany's most modern vehicles. Panthers and Tigers represented enormous investments of industrial effort. Their loss weakened German formations far beyond the immediate battlefield. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to produce tanks, artillery, and aircraft in quantities Germany could not match. The exchange rate of the battle favored the Red Army not because it lost fewer vehicles, but because it could replace losses without disrupting future operations. Air power followed the same pattern. The Luftwaffe entered the battle already weakened. Losses sustained during the fighting further reduced its ability to contest airspace. After Kursk, German air units increasingly shifted to defensive roles, reacting to Soviet advances rather than shaping them. The Red Army Air Force, by contrast, expanded its presence and improved coordination with ground forces. Air superiority in the east became contested, and then, increasingly, Soviet-dominated. Perhaps the most important consequence was doctrinal. Kursk demonstrated that Germany could no longer win by planning alone. The Red Army had anticipated German methods, constructed defenses accordingly, and absorbed the attack without panic. This was not the Soviet Army of 1941. It was an adaptive force capable of learning, preparing, and executing large-scale counteroffensives with precision. Germany's traditional advantages, initiative, surprise, operational tempo, were neutralized. After Kursk, the strategic initiative passed decisively to the Soviet Union. Within weeks, major Soviet offensives rolled forward along broad fronts. German forces were compelled into continuous retreat, fighting rearguard actions rather than shaping campaigns. Each withdrawal shortened German options and increased dependence on static defenses that could be bypassed or crushed by overwhelming firepower. Crucially, there was no recovery phase. Earlier German defeats had been followed by periods of stabilization or renewed offensives. After Kursk, such pauses disappeared. The Red Army maintained pressure relentlessly. German forces were denied the time needed to rebuild formations or reorganize command structures. What Germany lost at Kursk was not just men and machines, but time, and time had become the most valuable resource of all. Politically and strategically, the implications were equally severe. Axis allies saw Kursk for what it was: proof that Germany could no longer guarantee victory in the east. Confidence eroded. Strategic coordination weakened. Germany increasingly found itself fighting alone, burdened by commitments it could no longer sustain. The Western allies also drew conclusions. Kursk confirmed that the Soviet Union was not merely surviving, but advancing toward decisive superiority. This shaped Allied planning for future operations, reinforcing the expectation that Germany would be forced to fight on multiple fronts under growing pressure. Germany's strategic isolation deepened. In historical memory, Kursk is often described as the largest tank battle in history. That description captures its scale, but not its meaning. The battle's true significance lies not in numbers, but in consequence. Kursk was the moment when Germany exhausted the last possibility of regaining the initiative through offensive action in the east. Afterward, every German operation was shaped by enemy decisions. Germany planned Kursk carefully. It chose the battlefield. It delayed for preparation. It committed its best forces. It did everything a declining power could do to force a decisive outcome. The failure was not one of courage or competence at the tactical level. It was a failure of strategic reality. Germany could no longer win a war defined by industrial output, manpower depth, and sustained pressure. From Kursk onward, the Eastern Front became a sequence of withdrawals, defenses, and localized counterattacks that delayed defeat but could not prevent it. The battle did not end the war. It ensured how the war would end. Kursk stands as a reminder that wars are not decided by intention or planning alone. They are decided by what can be replaced, sustained, and adapted under pressure. At Kursk, Germany proved it could still fight. It also proved that fighting was no longer enough. If you want battle-by-battle breakdowns that show why armies lose, not myths, not hero stories, subscribe to WWW2 Battles. Every video, one battle, real numbers, real consequences.